So I don't know if you noticed, but there was an election in the US fairly recently, and it's turned out to be the biggest market in Betfair's history. I was going to record a video before the market ended, but I ran out of time. But I thought you may gain some insight from the sort of stuff that I was looking at during the election, and that's what I'm going to talk about in this video. If you've enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and subscribe, or even comment on the video if you wish. The more you do that, the more videos I can produce. But also don't forget to visit betangel.com and download a free trial. So, interesting times. Donald Trump, the host of The Apprentice, is now US President, or US President-elect I should say, at this moment in time. And curiously, especially given he's got no political background, I think it's going to be even more interesting. But if you look at political systems, in fact, the figurehead of a state very often can't actually make that many decisions anyway, as Barack Obama showed us. Despite having the will to get things done, a lot of the legislation was blocked. And you see the same thing in the UK at the moment as well, in that it's Parliament in its entirety that makes decisions, not an individual. And that's actually what democracy is based on. So yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see how the presidential term plays out and what impact it has, and maybe it will have an impact on our industry. Trump does own a number of gambling interests, but the interesting thing is the Republicans tend to be anti-gambling, typically, because of religious beliefs and so on. Anyhow, let's all put that to one side and leave that for another debate. I'm sure that's going to be debated for quite a few years now and in the future. The interesting thing about the US presidential market, it's a market I've followed since 2004. I've got data going back since 2004. And I've always taken an interest in it, but not often in the distant past actively traded. And it's only in recent years, I think it was 2008 was the first market I traded properly. And this year I traded it a bit more actively, and apparently so did everybody else, because the turnover was just short of an astonishing 200 million. It was the biggest Betfair market ever. And you sort of had a feeling it was going to develop like that, because the referendum, the EU referendum in the UK, was the previous biggest market. That turned over 114 million, nearly 115 million. And it's interesting to see how politics have, political markets, that's the word I was looking for, have grown over time. They're really improving and turning into big markets in themselves. But early on in this market, it was really just a case of trading news flow. So as one piece of news came out on one side of the party, the chart would go up, and then it would go back down and up and down and up and down. So I was in and out of the market repeatedly. There's a great thread on the forum about it where you can see us debating what we should do next and where we think things are going to go. But the interesting thing about these markets is there's no model that you can particularly use. You can't say, oh, it's going to be this price. You just have to jump in and out on good and bad news. So, you know, when Trump was making all of these errors and interesting remarks about his relationship with women, the opportunity there, curiously, was not to lay him, because the price would react dramatically at that point and go flying out. I was actually backing him at these points. And then when some bad news about Clinton came out, the price on Trump would come back in, at which point I'd reverse my position and just wait for the next news story to come in. So if you look at the chart was going like this all of the time, and it provided the opportunity to trade in and out consistently. So this was almost like a pre-off market, really, in terms of its behaviour. The market was moving around all over the place, and there was opportunities to get involved at many different points within that particular market. But essentially what you're doing is trading news flow. You're looking for stories and then taking a position. But, and I was giving counsel on Twitter about this, when something bad happens, it generally makes sense to do the opposite of what you think. So, you know, when Trump came out with his remarks that he made in the bus, you have to laugh, don't you, really? The price absolutely shot out, and lots of people were saying, oh yeah, lay Trump, and it's like, well, no, actually, I'm quite tempted to back him at this point, because, you know, a story will reverse at some point and head back in the other direction. So I was consistently against whatever the news story was at that particular point in time, and I was expecting for the price to come back in the other direction at some point. You could never tell why it would do that. You would just anticipate that that would probably happen, and it happened repeatedly all the way through the campaign. However, when we came to election night, if you go on Twitter, you'll be able to see some of the dialogue that was going on in the early hours of the morning. What the opportunity was there was to try and anticipate where the broad swing was going to occur on that particular night. So the way that I did that and the way that I anticipated that is I went back and I looked at all of the previous elections. So I was really interested in seeing how all of the results came in. And the interesting thing about it is if you look at the US, it's a continent over 4 time zones. There's 4-hour difference between one side on the East Coast and the West Coast. And if you actually look back at historical results, I'm going to move over slightly and you'll see a little video pop up over here. I actually went back and looked at how the votes came in state by state and how they were apportioned and to try and look for patterns, because obviously when the votes came in, as you went from east to west coast, then there would be a certain pattern of activity that would tend to develop. And what we've tended to find in recent years is that East Coast, there could be a number of different types of results coming in there, but as you move to the Midwest, it's predominantly Republican, and as you move to the West Coast, it's predominantly Democrat. So you could begin to get a feeling of where the activity was going to go and how things were going to pan out just by looking at that. And you can't go back endlessly, because you know what happened to George Washington is not going to be relevant to today, but you can begin to build a bit of a picture in terms of how you expect the market to develop. So when Trump started to get some of those key states on the East Coast, you could tell that in fact there probably weren't going to be enough left by the time it went through the Midwest and out to the West Coast for Clinton to win. So you had the opportunity to trade that. Now what I also did, I'm going to throw up a graph here of what happened on the night, but you can see, I think it was about 2:40 in the morning was when some of the key results came in and the whole pattern switched in the other direction. And you could see that up until then everybody was sort of thinking maybe that perhaps Clinton may be able to pull something off, but as soon as the results started to come in, you can see the retracement was really quick. And this seems to be a pattern that's developed in other elections as well, in that when the voting starts to come in, the decision is made fairly quickly. The market reacts and moves quite substantially at that particular point in time. So it was an interesting market, and there were sort of ways that you could get involved in terms of trading it, but it's not as simple, I think, as some of the other markets where you have definable entry and exit points. You're just trading news flow, and when you actually get to the night itself, then you're trying to build a pattern of where votes are going to come in and how that's going to influence the outcome. Because obviously if on this occasion Trump picks up more than expected on the East Coast, then that's going to significantly swing the results. And when we move into the Midwest, when the results are coming in, that's going to consolidate it. And if that's too many by then Clinton doesn't have a hope when it reaches the West Coast. So yeah, an interesting night, an interesting election, Betfair's biggest market. And you know, it's interesting to see the political markets are becoming quite strong. I've gathered and looked at loads of data on all of these markets, and you can go down to some level of detail within it, but predominantly up until election night you're trading news flow, and then on the actual night itself you're best off understanding exactly how the voting patterns are going to influence things. And I tend to find this easier in the US because you've got all of these different time zones and you've got really good quality data coming out of the markets and out of the actual polling stations fairly early on. But it was interesting to note that the pollsters got it wrong again, and they've been consistently wrong. And the problem with polling is if you go up to somebody in the street and say, how are you going to vote? They don't know you, they have no relationship with you, and even if your friend asked you how you're going to vote, you probably wouldn't tell them. And it's considered a deeply personal thing, your voting preference. So it's no surprise to me that the poll companies keep getting it wrong, because how are you going to vote Republican? Because they're not saying what they're going to do, they're saying what they think you should, the pollster wants to hear, or the situation in which they're in is going to hear. But when it comes to the ballot box, people make their decisions based around some other aspect of things. And if you look at the voting patterns across the US, that tells a really interesting story. I was over there not so long ago, and you can tell, depending upon the part of the country in, which way it's going to swing one way or the other, and why, which is quite interesting. But yeah, interesting times, interesting market, and it'll be interesting to wait for the next big market to come around and see how that performs. But certainly political markets on Betfair are getting substantially bigger, and they're definitely worth a look. Click here to subscribe to our YouTube channel. You'll get instant notification of new videos as they're released.